Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Made in Bartlett, a program dedicated to the primary industries of Bartlett. I want to thank First South Financial for sponsoring this podcast, which it would not be possible without their support, and also make a shout out to V2 Media for production. Today, we're joined by two gentlemen, very learned gentlemen and experienced, Blake Swaggart and John Churchill. And I'm going to go into a little bit of introduction of both of them, but I'm just going to let the viewers know that we're going to take a different route on this episode. We're going to focus our attention on economic development and the fundamentals thereof. And we have, as I mentioned, two gentlemen here that we're going to delve into this topic because it's an enigma, I think, to a lot of folks. Blake Swaggart is with the Tennessee Department of Economic and Community Development. He's been in the West Tennessee market for about 28 years now, I believe, and you're now the director of the Memphis market. Yes. And I'll let you explain that more in more detail later. And John Churchill, who is very, well, how should I put this? Learned, I guess is the best way, but John Churchill is sort of a workforce guru in the Memphis area. He's been involved in workforce training for the better part of his life. And I know that John started off as in the Navy, worked as a trainer there, and went then into the private sector after retiring 20 years in the Navy. And so his experience is very, very broad, and we couldn't ask for a better person to talk about workforce development. But first, I want to start with Blake. Blake, I've known you for, close to 30 years, I guess, and you've been with the Tennessee Department of Economic and Community Development for almost 30 years.
31.
31 years, okay. And so first of all, let me ask you to explain to our viewers what exactly is the Department of Economic and Community Development.
It's a department that is primarily geared to work toward recruitment of industry. It really kind of started around a precept in the 1950s and 1960s of a group of men from Nashville called 10 Men from Tennessee, started going to the Midwest from New York, Buffalo, Chicago, Cleveland, more or less making companies in those areas aware of what was in Tennessee and where Tennessee was. In the 1970s, a department was formed because of this. This 10 Men from Tennessee led to the formation of planning, which was under the governor's office, primarily to set up an office to recruit industry. When Governor Alexander came in 1978, at that time you started seeing investment and other companies around the world starting to look in the United States, primarily Japan. And this really turned Tennessee's fortune because of its location in the geographic center of the United States and in the U.S. It primarily led to some of the first industries locating right here in Shelby County, Sharp Corporation, in the late 1970s. And it wasn't long after that, Nissan located the first foreign automotive plant in the United States in Smyrna, Tennessee. At that time, it was the focus that you could show a client, and Governor Alexander, when he was meeting with Nissan executives, basically showed a map of the United States, and it was basically a picture of at night of the lights. And Tennessee was right in the geographic center of the United States. And all of a sudden, when Nissan made that decision to locate in Tennessee, Tennessee became the southern automotive belt.
That's very good history there, Blake. In fact, I'll let the viewers know that I, too, am a former employee of the Tennessee Department of Economic Community Development. It's my alma mater. And I was there in the early 80s when Lamar Alexander was governor and Nissan had just announced. And it did transform Tennessee. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Tennessee was kind of an afterthought, I think, to a lot of companies in the Midwest and the Northeast who were looking to relocate. But when the Japanese and Nissan picked Tennessee to locate their first American manufacturing facility, the first Japanese automotive plant in the country, it made folks sit up. And because the Japanese in the 1980s had the reputation for being extremely thorough and did their homework diligently. And so the business community was asking, golly, what we must have overlooked something in Tennessee because the Japanese have picked it. So anyway, that began that. Now I will go back and mention this for our Shelby County viewers, is that it was a Miffian who actually created the department, and that was Winfield Dunn. Before that, it was an office of the governor. But Winfield Dunn, when he came in, he saw the need to form a department. So I believe it was under his tenure that the department was created. John, let me just touch on you real quick. Now, your background is obviously workforce development or training, and you've got many years, decades actually, in this area. Can you give us a little bit of background on yourself, and we want to delve a little bit more later about what trends you've seen take place in this arena, but give us a little bit of background about yourself.
Okay. Well, I joined the Navy in '63 and had the good fortune of being able to work with training devices, understanding training devices as it pertained to the actual field, and then not only assisting with the developing of new training devices, but then how to train somebody. And it was an exciting career. I did that for 20 years. We even in the military even delved in where we decided that we could take anybody, giving them a manual. It was back then called self-paced learning. It was a failed experiment, but it was an experiment. And when I got out of the Navy, went to work for Kimberly-Clark as a training manager. And through the career, Kimberly-Clark and then International Paper or Champion Paper at that time, Nabisco, and then the Brazilian Steel Company. So I've always been in training and trying to find out how a company can find the right talent with the right skills and then motivate that individual to continue to advance their career and learn through their career.
Right. And so to talk about economic development, if you boil it down to the very essence of what economic development is, and Blake, correct me if you think I'm leaving something out, but it's really quite simple. Economic development is about creating jobs, and also coupled with recruiting capital investment. You can't have one without the other, really. But creating good paying jobs is what economic development is all about. And of course, you hear politicians all day long talk about, creating jobs and economic development, but that's basically what it's all about. And to make that happen, to ensure that you can create jobs in a region, in a state, in a community, there's three primary factors that make that possible. The first one is real estate. You've got to have land and or building to satisfy the need of the client or the company that's looking to locate. Next, you have to have the infrastructure. You can have all the land in the world, but if you don't have the infrastructure to service that land is doing no good. And then the third one is workforce. You got to have a trainable workforce. They don't have to be or don't have to have necessarily the skill at the time, but they have to be trainable. When you say, John, that's
good comment.
So Blake, let's talk about how ECD, which is what we call it in the area, how does ECD work in those three factors?
Primarily, we have to have a good site. That's the first thing that a company's looking for, is that they've got to be able to locate that operation that they're going to be coming into, and they have to have a site that is going to be pretty much mitigated. And that's where the state, the local communities have to work in making sure that we're showing a site that has most of the infrastructure there, has been mitigated on an environmental side, because what we're trying to do is mitigate risk. We're mitigating risk to the client. And we want to make sure that we have the best location for that's company. The other piece of this is infrastructure. One of our main programs we used to have years ago was the Fast Track Infrastructure Program. It was put in place by Governor McWhorter, and it allowed us to be able to go in and help communities provide basic infrastructure, water, sewer, gas, to get that site ready for that client. Because a lot of times when that due diligence process is being done, the company is, when they make that decision to locate, they're hitting the ground running because they're under a time factor to be up and operational so they can get product out their door and to help make money for the company, provide good wages to the employees, and also train that employee to understand their process and state-of-the-art technology. So they all tie very, very closely together, because what we try to do is mitigate risk for that client, because at the end of the day, they're going to select a community that basically has the least risk for that client.
Yep. In fact, Blake, when you and I first got in the business, a lot of the companies that were looking to expand or relocate, we dealt directly with them. But in the last 30 years or so, you've seen a trend away from working directly with the company and now working with site specialists, site selection specialists. And they're working with a client that we normally don't know who that is. They're working incognito. But a site selection specialist, and people make a living, representing companies looking for the perfect site. But their first job is to eliminate you, basically. They'll put out an inquiry for a location, whether it be land or building or a combination of both, or they'll take either one. But they're looking at the low-hanging fruit. And if you're not able to meet their minimum criteria, then they're going to cut you out. So it's very competitive, and we'll talk a little bit later about incentives and how that plays a role. But first and foremost, the client is looking for the real estate. They want to make certain the infrastructure there, and they want to make certain that the labor will be there. And John, let's talk about labor situations. So the state, they don't, we'll talk about Blue Oval City, and that's kind of unique because the state, previous to Blue Oval City, never got in the real estate business, but local communities did. And so a lot of your rural communities throughout Tennessee actually own industrial parks, okay? And now that's not true in Memphis. Well, Memphis does have Pigeon and President's Island. But in most rural communities throughout the state, you'll see where the municipality or the county or both own the industrial land and are responsible for the infrastructure. And so the state would provide funding or grants to allow these local municipalities to develop parks, but never got into the business until the Memphis mega site.
2009.
And we'll talk about that in a little bit, because that was a new venture by the state, and a lot of history and controversy over that whole venture, but it's paid off. But John, workforce development, that's another area that the state, now the state's involved in it, but not through ECD. ECD provides grants and that type thing for training, but it's up to either public institutions or private institutions to provide that training. And John, that's where you come in, because I know you've worked a lot of projects where a company or companies are needing skill sets, or needing to take some candidates for a particular job. They may not have the skills needed for that job, but there are ways to screen these applicants, these candidates, to determine whether or not they would be trainable. So, and there's a long process for this. So could you walk us through that a little bit? And because, that's, you hear people say, well, you can't get good workers nowadays, and of course there is a tight labor market right now. So if you don't mind, John, elaborate on
Sure.
that in your perspective. I mean, you've been around long enough, you know these things, right?
Well, first of all, early on, if you needed candidates, many times your workforce would make recommendations, especially in the rural committees, and people knew you had jobs, you had a reputation in the community, whether it was urban or rural, and people would come to your door, or they would put in applications, answer the paper, a lot of different ways. With the advance of all the social media and able to go out there on the internet and ask for a particular position and get all of these applicants, what's happened, I think, is companies have kind of lost their way on how to find candidates who really are good candidates, and the candidates haven't got a clue what to put in. What are the keywords you put into a resume or you put into an application so the company will notice you? You have a job and you have hundreds of applicants, and unfortunately, mostly what we work into is the frontline worker. We're not looking for the college graduates. All those folks can find their way in the companies. It's easy to find them. But if I'm someone looking to be a machine operator, maintenance is fairly easy to find too. But if I'm on a machine operator, or I want a job and I want an entry-level position, I don't have a clue how to be noticed. I'll put in applicants for months and never hear anything, just total dead silence. I lose the excitement of getting that job. I get discouraged, and then I go through times where I won't even look. And so what we do is we help the company find those good candidates. And the best way to do that is actually do training. Provide some type of short-term training, and have some hard skills in there and some social skills in there, where the individual gets a better understanding what the company's looking for. And by going through that training, they get frontline privileges of being able to talk to that company. We invite companies into the training. So what we feel our job is to help, kind of a locator, to help that company and great employees to find each other. And Memphis, I'm going to tell you something, and I've always believed that. Memphis has got one of the largest good pool of candidates than any city of this size in America. They're out there. They just don't know how to find their way to the good jobs. And we have temp agencies that sometimes hurt the system, because I go to work for a temp agency. In 48 hours, or anybody in this city almost couldn't get a job with a temp agency doing something. So the temp agent makes it easy for me to quit a job, go to Aunt Martha's wedding, take a few days off, and then go to another temp agency and get my job back somewhere. And so it's almost like we've trained some of our local workforce on how to be transient. And so go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, no. In fact, that brings up an interesting point because we've all three been around long enough to know what comes around goes around, right? Back when I first got started in the business, and Blake, you probably as well. And I'm pretty old fashioned when it comes to economic development because I believe that manufacturing is a important part of our economy. It usually provides the best paying jobs, and it produces something. I mean, it actually makes something, and that's very, very important. And yet I saw in the early 2000s, I believe, there was a movement among academicians and others to get people away from making things. Of course, that's when globalization took off in a big way. But the attitude was, well, we'll just ship it off to China or Southeast Asia or some other countries and let them do all the manufacturing. We'll become a service-oriented society. That hasn't necessarily worked out because now we're all talking about reshoring. We're finding out how delicate the supply chain, the global supply chain is. And so there is a pretty hefty movement to bring manufacturing back so that we're not dependent on far off markets. So, John, I mean, you've seen that. Blake, I think you've seen that too. Mm-hmm. Have you seen an increase in manufacturing jobs? Of course, the state has always focused.
We've always focused on manufacturing because, as you were saying, manufacturing creates wealth, and that's what the intent is. We're trying to increase the median average wage of every Tennessean in the state of Tennessee. That's one of our primary missions, to make sure we recruit the right companies with the right brand that help Tennessee grow our brand, because we want to see these companies succeed, and we want these companies to be successful. Going back to Nissan, and now Tennessee is known as primarily outside of Detroit, the Southern Automotive Belt. We have 4 OEM manufacturers getting ready to be in production by 2025. You have Nissan, you have GM, you have VW, and now you have Ford. 4 OEMs. Then you have Peterbilt and Nashville. So you technically have 5 OEMs. We have, because of our geographic...
OEM, you might want to explain to some
original equipment manufacturer. Original equipment manufacturer is that primary automotive assembly that every state is looking to recruit to their community and to their state, and to build their brand.
And those OEMs rely on suppliers, and the supplier base usually employs more people than the actual OEM.
Because of Tennessee's geographic location in the southeast, when Nissan located, it wasn't far behind Toyota, located just to the north. You started seeing all the major corporations locate major auto plants. BMW went to South Carolina. You started seeing this migration to the southeast because they saw that they could be near their customers within a day or day and a half. And those suppliers started to locate in Tennessee because of our geographic location, that they could locate in Tennessee. They could supply Toyota. They could supply Nissan. They could supply Hyundai or BMW, whatever they needed to do, Honda. So Tennessee's geographic location has helped us tremendously over the years of being centrally located. And we didn't have, in those early days, we didn't have to spend a lot of money to recruit those companies because they needed to be in Tennessee because of the geographic location and proximity to customers.
Yeah. Well, and John, on the workforce side, I mean, you've seen this trend back toward manufacturing, back toward higher skill demands. Okay. So do you want to elaborate a little or give your perspective on what you have seen the last 4 or 5 decades?
Yeah, and I'll talk specifically about the Memphis area. In the 70s, Memphis was a great manufacturing area, and it had, the labor force was great. The schools supported it. Memphis schools and Shelby County schools had great programs to support the vocational, or now we call it STEM. And as we become known more and more as a logistics company, and as these manufacturing companies were closed down, then Memphis kind of become the personality of a great logistics area. The problem with that, the logistics jobs didn't take, I had one logistics customer, very big in Memphis, said, I don't need a high school graduate. It takes me a half hour to show somebody how to pack a box. And so having skills wasn't that important. All right, now that manufacturers moving on, now that you guys have helped companies see the value of Tennessee, Memphis is playing a catch up that because that personality has literally transferred itself to the workforce. It doesn't take a lot to find a job. It's easy to find a job. You don't need to know a lot. And now all of a sudden, in Shelby County schools, Bartlett schools also is doing a fantastic job with that catch-up. They're tying in with TechEd and other Southwest Tennessee Community College. And very quickly, they have transitioned themselves to developing workforce that do have the skills necessary. But it's going to take time.
Yeah, and you hit on a subject matter we don't have time to go into all this. And I'm pretty feel certain that we're going to have to come back and address a lot of these other issues. But when I was in high school, the guys all had required to take shop, the girls required to take home ec. They wanted the guys to have some type of skill and to kind of guide them into whether or not that was a career path they wanted to go in. And then they got away from that.
But just real quick, when you say the skills, I'll tell you what, teaching someone how to use their hands and teaching someone to have a specific skill and solve problems with that skills is critical thinking skills. And that's one of the biggest things. I don't care what field you go into. You may end up being the CEO of a company, but having physical skills and being able to think through problems is extremely important for the workforce because one of the key things that all employees need is those critical thinking skills.
Right. But the schools, they got away from technical training. And for a couple of decades, I guess. And now you're seeing a reemergence of the technical training. Bartlett High School is a prime example, but they're all going back to that.
Yeah, they are. And the fact that Bartlett was able to bring TCAT in here in the city of Bartlett shows that dedication. And they're doing it fairly rapid. And I think that's one of the reasons they were able to get companies like Ford and Blue Oval to get started and stuff like that. Yeah,
and unfortunately, we're not going to have time to talk about Mega Site and Blue Oval. We're going to have to come back, Blake, and address that. One thing, though, I want to talk about real quickly is the incentives that are offered to a lot of these companies by the state of Tennessee and by local government as well. And it's you're seeing a lot of it in workforce. So just in a quick summary, Blake, could you address why the state is involved in incentives and what exactly are they used for?
Going back to my original statement that in the original days we had sites, companies would locate here to be close to their customers. As they started doing business and other companies and our southeastern competitors started being more competitive in that marketplace, we had to offer incentives. First, we offered infrastructure incentives to help offset infrastructure costs to communities to make sure we could get that infrastructure to that site for that company to build. Then we started focusing on our workforce incentives, where we would have a team when a company would locate, especially foreign companies. We would send teams to Japan. We would basically sit in a room like this, go through their whole training process, videotape it, walk through the process that we could come back and more or less train the trainer. And without them having to send a lot of people overseas, or we could provide that technical service to them with that equipment that we had, be able to provide that training. In the early 2000s, we started to see our tax code kind of change. We always had incentives in the tax code to help in manufacturers. It was always geared in the 1960s to at least help manufacturers with an incentive to help their business taxes, to help cut down on their franchise and excise tax. In the early 2000s, we started to see that we needed to create more incentives around that, really kind of a job tax credit to help create more value that companies could see that if they hired more people, that they would get more credits to offset their basic business taxes in Tennessee. And then we saw another shift in the early 2000s when Governor Haslam, Commissioner Haggerty at that time, Senator Haggerty now, said we need to be more competitive and be able to provide incentives that can be cash grants directly to companies to help them build out their existing space if they are going to create jobs and make substantial capital investments. So we've seen this whole from the 1960s to now, where consultants look at all of this, the big picture. It used to be site, used to be, could we provide the workers, as John said, could we train them? But now, when you said the site consultants and the Site Consultants Guild came in, they started driving that we need to be able to say, how do we show our client the value on books to the client that it's economical to locate in this state, and looking at the 5 to 10 year projection that this company will be profitable moving forward.
But so incentives become a factor. I don't think any company locates in an area simply because of the incentives, but they do sweeten the pot. But I would like to say too that the state and local government as well use a cost benefit analysis on every project. And if it's not a positive ratio, then seldom are incentives utilized to attract a company.
And ours goes back to even now that we look at the county median wage. You have to be above the county median wage for us to incentivize you, because we're trying to build the brand, build the quality of the jobs.
Right.
And the manufacturing jobs. And it goes back to what you were saying about manufacturing. Manufacturing jobs, the dollar turns over 7 times in the community. And when folks have more money, they spend more money on cars, washing machines, new houses, which basically help increase local revenue, state revenue. Because we're such a sales tax driven state, we have to have big ticket items sell.
Yeah.
And John, but one thing, when you say that the incentives aren't always important, in the Memphis area, we've got Mississippi and we've got Arkansas. As we increase our skills and our viability of our workforce, that's on them too. And so they use the Memphis population and the Memphis workplace to help sell for a company to come over to Mississippi or into Arkansas. And so, quite frankly, when you're recruiting people in this area, those incentives do become important because you've got two other states that are using our workforce. Mm-hmm. All they got left is incentives.
Yeah, well, I mean, Memphis market is very unique nationally.
And John made a good point about the TCAP Bartlett, the shift from, technical skills to 4-year college. Now we're going back to technical skills. And Governor Lee in this past legislature, we're going to invest $1 billion in our TCATs across the state to help prepare us for Ford and Blue Oval, but also this new technologies that's coming down that we haven't seen, where it be around electric batteries, lithium batteries, building these battery packs for these electric vehicles, which is changing the paradigm in the automotive industry.
Yeah.
And so we as a state and communities have to be prepared for this shift coming, in 10, 20, 30 years.
Yeah, we do. Well, we can go on and on, folks. Y'all know that. I mean, Blue Oval City, that's the mega site. A lot of, and of course, technical training. We're going to have Gwen Sutton with TCAD and probably Tracy Hall. I'd love to get her from Southwest and some others to talk about what's being offered on the technical side of training now, because there has been a focus on technical training. But I guess for now we need to cut it short, and we'll be back on this subject. If you like the conversation that you're hearing, then please subscribe to our podcast and let us know. We want to thank First South Financial again for sponsoring this, for making this podcast possible, and also recognize V2 Media for production. Joey's over there, and he's been very patient, and so we appreciate your work, Joey. Mark, on the other hand, he just sits at his desk. But anyway, folks, appreciate you watching, and we'll see you again next time.